Chapter 3. Boy Meets World. The previous 6 months had been hard. We'd been pushed to our limits. Yet it was worth it, as we were now Guardsmen, and had arrived at our regiment, the 1st Battalion of the Irish Guards. The rank of Guardsman is the equivalent of that of a private soldier. However, as Guardsmen, it was drilled into us that we were superior. The battalion would receive 5 new excited Guardsmen, 2 from the Republic of Ireland, a Scouser, a Mancunian, and a South African, 4 of whom, including myself, were Catholics. The initial few days when joining a battalion are a real culture shock. Again, we had received no leave, and were to report directly to our battalion. Our first stop being at the guard room. The guard commander and the regional police corporal would initially have a little fun by having us perform stupid tasks for their amusement. I would later learn that these two, despite being non-commissioned officers, NCOs, lacked any respect within the battalion, and this was one of the few times that they had any authority by harassing the new guys. After this short-lived bit of drill, we were then put into temporary accommodation for the evening. I remember feeling very insecure, as we were now very small fish in a very large pond. The following morning, we were introduced to the commanding officer and the regimental sergeant major. We were then informed that we would be joining No. 4 Company, and that we would be deploying to Northern Ireland the following March. By now, I wasn't concerned or fearful about deploying on an operational tour, as this was the job that I had trained so hard for, and my excitement outweighed my apprehension. I was still only 17 years old at this point, a boy, and I was about to be introduced to a man's world. The accommodation at Queen Elizabeth Barracks was very dated by today's standards, and for Guardsmen, this consisted of sharing 8-man rooms. For the next few days, the 5 of us hid away in this room, curtains drawn and door locked. Eventually, the duty sergeant for 4 Company, or in military terms, sergeant in waiting, found us and introduced us to our new company sergeant major, CSM. Growing up in Manchester, when being introduced to a new group, the first question was always, "What football team do you support?" In training, this had changed to, "Where are you from?" Now this had evolved again, with the company sergeant major asking us what religion we were. I thought to myself, what has that got to do with anything? Once the company sergeant major had established that we were mostly Catholics, his demeanour changed. Then he happily informed us that we were joining a predominantly Protestant company, and that we were going to inevitably get filled in, military slang for beaten up. And if we were a bit of a fighter and fought back, then the NCOs would fill us in. And if somehow we managed to fight them off, then he would fill us in. Either way, we were getting filled in. Being 17 and naive, and not one to ever back down from a fight, I thought to myself yet again, challenge accepted. I remember feeling disappointed at the lack of respect that we were receiving, and, if I'm being completely honest, at this point, I didn't understand what sectarian racism was, or the history of Ireland for that matter. Regardless, if forced to, I wasn't afraid to fight, and I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. The following day, my whole perception changed when we were introduced to our equals, our fellow Guardsmen. I would have trouble understanding and accepting the seniority structure within the sub-rank of my peers. Some of them were almost 30 years old, and had been in the battalion for 12 years, whereas we had just arrived. I had mistakenly assumed that we were all equal, as we had earned the same rank, and this lack of understanding would make my initial year in the Irish Guards and my new home in 10 Platoon a living hell. I cringe now when I recall some of the belittling events that would frequently occur, particularly chair. A senior guardsman would yell, "Chair!" and I was required to get on all fours so that he could sit on me. The intimidation of the mob and the peer pressure of the masses had immediately knocked the fight out of me. Or maybe this was a result of the 6 months' behavioural conditioning that I had endured. I'd become submissive and can only conclude that this was the result of my training. We were nominated for every shit job, and I couldn't comprehend why this was happening, as we were all the same rank. All guardsmen, all equals, weren't we? I would speak up about this only to find more jobs and chairs coming my way. Niall was smart. He just cracked on and was eventually left alone. Looking back, I can't help but think, why couldn't I have been more like Niall? It's not that these were bad guys. This was just a rite of passage that all guardsmen went through. Regrettably, years later, when I was a more senior guardsman, I would also be part of the pack and bully the new guys. I'm ashamed by this, especially having been through a horrendous experience myself as a new guardsman. But unfortunately, we were all institutionalized, and this was our normal. I will never forget the night of my 18th birthday. We were all fast asleep in our 8-man room when our door was kicked in. A large group of guardsmen stormed the room, screaming wildly the name of one of my friends. It was obvious they were all drunk. Then they proceeded to beat the crap out of one of the guys who I had passed out with. But why? The previous day, we'd had snacks in a nearby cafe at the neighbouring barracks where recruits were trained. He had confidently jumped the queue, which was not an uncommon act for trained soldiers to do. However, at the till, the lady cashier didn't believe that we were trained soldiers, guardsmen, and thought we were recruits, just trying our luck. We collectively explained that we were, and thought nothing more of the uneventful incident. Unbeknown to us, this was one of the wives of a senior guardsman within 4 Company, and despite what we had perceived as a monotonous encounter, the senior guardsman and his wife felt differently. My buddy reluctantly sat up in his bed and was quickly surrounded by this drunken mob, and they proceeded to interrogate him about the incident at the CAF, whilst the rest of us were told to go back to sleep, as this didn't concern us. This kangaroo court would determine that it was because we acted like guardsmen, trained soldiers, and had jumped the queue at the CAF. But evidently, it was speaking to the senior guardsman's wife that was somehow the real crime. She did ask my buddy's name, and by confidently providing this, we had condemned him to a midnight beating in his bed. Yet again, I look back and I regret my interaction at just lying there. And I am sure that the other 4 feel the same. Within 2 weeks, the constant belittling and sectarian abuse had knocked all of our confidence. So we just lay there listening to the thuds and yelps as one of our friends was beaten to a pulp in his bed beside us. The next morning on parade, it was obvious what had occurred, as my friend had a head like a smashed cabbage. No questions were asked. And I couldn't help thinking to myself, was this beating due to his religion? Was that even a thing? The use of excessive violence was the norm in most infantry battalions in the 1990s. The men were trained to fight, to kill, and often vented on each other. But this felt different, and I couldn't understand exactly how. That afternoon, I remember attending the junior ranks Christmas party in the cookhouse. We were intentionally positioned together in the corner of the hall so that the rest of the Guardsmen could throw food, cans of beer, or whatever they could find at us. This had nothing to do with our religion, but more so the fact that we were the new guys, and this institutionalized behavior and bullying was just accepted at the time. The Ministry of Defence and senior officers would never like to acknowledge the fact that sectarian racism was rife within the Irish Guards, a famous regiment that was the Queen's 4th Regiment of Foot Guards and was always in the limelight. As a child, I had witnessed national racism, and, of course, racism was rife in the 1980s. But this was derived from ethnicity and skin colour. Initially, I couldn't understand sectarian racism, as wasn't this the Irish versus the Irish? Were we not all in the British Army? Had we not all sworn an oath to the Queen? As a company of men, we were training for our deployment in Northern Ireland, more specifically, South Armagh, the notorious bandit country. So surely, we should be working as a team, together. It was no surprise that we were nominated for guard duty over the Christmas leave period in 1996. And this was quite a calm and refreshing period for us. 2 weeks with only a skeleton crew within the barracks. We would be required to conduct guard duty for a 24-hour period, then have a whole day to ourselves. But most of all, we would be left alone. I enjoyed this luxury as my feet were yet to touch the ground ever since that first day of training when I had turned up late with just my Mancunian swagger. I would use this downtime to improve my fitness on the vigorous training area of the Purbright Hills. I would run for hours in the freezing cold and found this very therapeutic. I would contemplate my decision to join the army, the assurances I was given by my recruiting sergeant about sports and adventure, and conclude that I had made a grave mistake. However, it was too late, and I was committed to 3 years' service. When the battalion returned from leave, we were thrown straight into Northern Ireland training, but not before a fitness test. I had excelled at fitness in training, and had narrowly missed out on receiving the Best PT trophy due to misdemeanours. In basic training, Niall was set to receive the award for Best Recruit, but we had sneaked out of the barracks while on adventure training to get some beers, and were inevitably foiled in the process. As such, they downgraded Niall to my award, and by reading my recruit reports some years later, I now realise that I was just fortunate to pass out. Even to this day, Niall enjoys reminding everyone how he was the fittest in training. As it was, he, and he alone, was presented with this prestigious accolade. Even in Catterick, I would always have difficulty keeping out of trouble, and now in battalion, things would appear to be no different. The British Army's basic fitness test has been called many different names throughout the years, but was essentially a 1.5-mile race after an energetic warm-up. This was conducted after 2 minutes of a maximum effort of sit-ups and press-ups. I was determined to prove to the company that I was one of them that desperately wanted to be accepted, and concluded that I would be accepted through my fitness. How wrong I was. I shot off like a bat out of hell, then quickly realised that I didn't know the route, so slowed down a little. I was confident of my running ability, as I'd always come first or second during my training and could complete the 1.5-mile run in just under 8 minutes. My aim was to finish in the middle third of the company, but to my surprise, no one was catching me. Eventually, 2 of the other guardsmen would catch up. We broke away from the main group, and a race was on. I was ecstatic with myself, having finished second. However, the guardsman who had won the race wasn't even out of breath. He was an army boxer, and his fitness levels were simply insane. Much to my disappointment, my future best friend, Frank, would finish third, and this would mark a fitness rivalry that would bond us during our careers. My pal, who had been beaten up in his bed a few weeks prior, was as fit as me, if not fitter. But to my surprise, he made little or no effort on this test. I suspect that this was due to his unjust beating, as he was just trying to go unnoticed under the radar. On return to our company offices, all of the guardsmen received a collective bollocking, telling off, regarding how poor their personal fitness was, as several of them had failed the test. I was then highlighted as a beaming example of what the other, more experienced soldiers should aspire to. Oh no, I thought to myself. This is only going to make things worse. Normally, after being on guard for the Christmas period, you take your leave in the January. But for us, our company was halfway through their pre-deployment training for Northern Ireland, and we needed to play catch-up. Hence, leave was cancelled. This catch-up never came. We were not given any remedial training, and were just expected to know all of the operational training methods. Then, if we did something wrong, we would be ridiculed and punished for not knowing the answers to a subject matter that we were never taught. Eventually, I had decided enough was enough, and that I would tackle these bullies, one at a time, just like I'd done previously whilst in a children's home. We were at Lydd Ranges in Kent at the time. It was February, and we were in a patrol base simulating a scenario from our imminent tour of Northern Ireland. I found myself in a sangha with one of the head Protestant bully boys, so I decided to antagonize him. After a little effort, he threw a punch at me, which I anticipated, blocked, then pinned him up against the wall. I told him that his victimization had to stop, or the next time I would hurt him. And that was that. Job done. Or so I thought. Our pre-deployment training was coming to an end, and we were going on leave for a few days. And I didn't want to be deploying on operations with any animosity amongst us. I vividly remember that after being on the ranges most of the night, I was in my sleeping bag in temporary accommodation, awaiting the platoon commander's briefing for the following day. The next thing I knew, I was held down, and the zip of my sleeping bag was pulled to the top, above my head, and I was trapped, cocooned inside. I was then beaten to a pulp, unable to fight back or even defend myself. It was the Northern Irish Mafia. After what appeared to be a lifetime, I could hear our platoon commander and sergeant had entered the room. The beating finally stopped, but not before they lifted the base of the bed 90 degrees up towards the ceiling, trapping me between the wall and the bed springs. I was then, and still am now, disgusted that neither my platoon commander nor my platoon sergeant did nothing to stop this. Instead, they chose to ignore what they had just witnessed and carried on with their briefing like this was a normal daily occurrence. As one can easily imagine, I was seriously regretting my decision to join the army at this point. I couldn't help but think that I had been victimized and beaten because of a religion that was forced upon me, and that I wasn't too fussed about to begin with. Furthermore, I also acknowledged that I was a cocky and very opinionated young man, and this may have been a contributing factor that had led to this brutal hiding. Maybe if I would have kept my head down, then this beating may not have occurred, or would have been significantly less vicious. But that was just not in my nature, and further beatings would follow. Around the time of my sleeping bag beating, Lance Bombardier Ristoric had been shot and killed by the IRA at Bestbrook Mill in South Armagh in the early February of that year. We were training as a company to deploy to this very base, and this was an unwanted reminder of the dangers that awaited us. Maybe this had had something to do with my sleeping bag beating. Maybe Ristoric's murder at the hands of the Roman Catholic IRA felt personal to the Guardsman from Ulster. So maybe by beating me they would be able to vent some of their own suppressed emotions and anger. And if this was in fact the case, I have something to say to this mob. You're welcome. Historically, as a formed body of men, the 1st Battalion Irish Guards were not allowed by the Ministry of Defence to deploy as a unit to Northern Ireland. They had completed just the one tour as a battalion in East Tyrone in 1995. This was due to the simple fact of security. As British soldiers, we were often priority targets for the IRA. Therefore, soldiers from Ulster were an easy target, and those from the Republic of Ireland would often have to keep their service a secret. At the height of the Troubles, it was not uncommon for soldiers to be killed whilst off duty or at their homes with their families, and this was the reason why so few Irish Guardsmen had previously deployed in Northern Ireland. Therefore, as the Irish Guards had a large contingent of soldiers from Ulster, the risk was considered far too great to deploy them as a battalion. Furthermore, many of these Guardsmen may have had ties, through their family or friends, to paramilitary organisations on both sides of the conflict, whether being the IRA or the UDF, UDA, or UVF. The other reason that was never mentioned was the increased tensions of the underlying sectarian racism that existed, and this was evident also through our unpleasant experiences in 4 Company. Roman Catholics and soldiers from the Republic of Ireland would often be referred to as dirty Fenian bastards, and this was widely accepted as just good, healthy banter. One must also analyse the familiarities and history between Ireland as a country and the Irish Guards as a regiment. Both of them had strong links to the Roman Catholic Church, with the Irish Guards being the only regiment in the British Army to be specifically allocated Catholic priests as military padres. Then there was the more important internal fighting for sectarian dominance to consider. The split between Republicans and Loyalists from the historic Troubles within Northern Ireland. This hereditary hatred for each other was instilled from birth, and despite now being on the same team as part of the British Army, always subconsciously remained. After 10 months of high intensity and traumatic training, I was finally granted 10 days pre-deployment leave. I hadn't enjoyed my Northern Ireland training for obvious reasons, and I was seriously considering going AWOL, absent without leave. I was crashing in my little brother's room in my mother's house, and I didn't particularly like this situation. But it was better than staying in barracks. So, I reluctantly headed home to Manchester. Then, on the 14th of March, after a heavy night out, I would find myself in the Accident and Emergency Department. The previous night, I'd lost my keys and had attempted to climb through my brother's first-floor bedroom window, but had slipped at the last moment. I'd landed awkwardly on my back, unfortunately, on the lip of the concrete steps below. I initially thought that I was just winded and was able to pick myself up off the ground before making my way back to the door that was ironically left open for me. Just typical, I thought to myself. The following morning I felt slightly stiff and was planning to go for a morning run when it finally dawned on me that I may have seriously injured myself. I was unable to put on my shoes and socks. Panic started in. The pain was not my concern. Let us not forget that I was now a tough, robust infantry soldier, and pain was weakness. It was the lack of independence and not being able to dress myself that worried me. Reluctantly, I persuaded my mother to take me to the accident and emergency department for an X-ray. Accident and emergency departments are a fun place to people watch. It was Friday morning after all, and during the long wait, I had amused myself by imagining how all the other idiots had ended up there. Due to the fact that I had walked into the department and that I had normal sensation in my legs, doctors and nurses were not particularly concerned about my little accident. This was until the results of my X-ray were reviewed. I've always been cheeky and recall that I was having banter and trying to chat up the nurses as I'd convinced myself that I'd only pulled a muscle and wasn't predominantly concerned. However, these nurses were now ignoring me and looking anxious before eventually returning to my cubicle with 2 doctors, one of them being a spinal consultant. Now I was extremely worried. The first words out of the consultant's mouth were, "What are you doing walking?" I jokingly replied, "It's like running, but at a much slower pace." Nobody laughed. He then explained that I had fractured my L1 vertebrae and that there was a risk that this could sever my spinal cord, paralyzing me from the waist down. The jokes ceased. The realization that I had broken my back began to set in. The consultant would later explain that this was a miracle break, and I was tremendously lucky that my spinal cord wasn't damaged in the process, and that any sudden movement could potentially damage my spinal cord. I didn't feel lucky. I felt disappointment. My only concern was that I was abandoning my comrades, as I would be unable to join them on their imminent tour of South Armagh. Looking back on this period, regarding my negative experiences in the early years of my career in the British Army, I can genuinely empathise with the Northern Irish Protestants of 4 Company. They had lived through the Troubles and, before they had even joined the British Army, had been fighting for Ulster to remain part of Great Britain. They had been taught from an early age to despise Catholics, and it was this generational hate that drove and motivated their future actions. However, this does not excuse them from their inexplicable behaviour. 9 years later, when I was a member of the Sergeant's Mess, I would accidentally bump into Lance Corporal F., now a civilian, detached from the military mindset, and now a completely different person. Lance Corporal F. couldn't apologise enough, was tearful, genuine, and full of regret for the way in which he had treated me. I acknowledged his apology and quickly moved on, as I accepted this for what it was at the time, a combination of sectarian racism and institutional bullying. I do not accept that the trauma of my early experiences of sectarian bullying in the Irish Guards attributed to my often poor mental health, as this was a reflection of society at the time, thus accepted. I believe that for me, acceptance was a key factor in my ability to manage this. Besides, I'd been taking beatings my whole life, and this was no different. However, years later, when I was a section commander, I would discover that some Ulstermen from the drums and pipes platoon had previously and violently initiated some of my lads, including Mad Dave, into the Ulster Volunteer Force. This inexplicable act was conducted with the use of balaclavas and pistols, and would have been very traumatic for the young men who had no familiarization or understanding of the affairs of Ulster. When the news of this encounter surfaced, we'd just returned from the war in Iraq, and we'd all been drinking heavily. By now, Mad Dave had fully grown into his ironic nickname, as before the war he was the polar opposite, timid and quiet. Nevertheless, we all wanted revenge. Reflecting back on the brawl that would now inevitably occur, this was my way of subconsciously seeking payback for the way that I had previously been treated by the cruel Protestants of 4 Company, and I will cover this event in more depth in a later chapter. The lasting effect of this sectarian bullying is the slight and unwanted subconscious prejudice that I once had towards Northern Ireland Protestants as a result. This is despite having many good friends from this demographic, and one cannot help but wonder if the old saying, "violence incites further violence," is actually true. The following Monday after breaking my back, I was due to report for duty, to deploy to Northern Ireland, and telephoned the company officers and spoke to one of the sergeants in an attempt to explain my unfortunate predicament. This particular sergeant was only too aware of the bullying that I had received, and concluded that I was making excuses to avoid deploying to Northern Ireland. He persisted to scream and shout down the phone to the extent that a nurse grabbed the phone from me and gave him a telling off in the manner that only nurses can. He then, more reservedly, wished me a quick recovery. Nurse 1. Terrifying Sergeant 0. The following day a doctor would inform me that it would be a long 2 weeks before I was allowed to stand unassisted, and it was unclear to whether or not I would make a full recovery. I had been admitted to Hope Hospital in Salford, the very hospital where, a few years beforehand, I had been part of a limited caper to steal some computers. Looking back on this from my hospital bed, I was so ashamed of my younger self. The doctors had told me that I wouldn't be able to walk unassisted for 3 months, run for 6 months, and that it would be very unlikely that I would ever be able to carry weight on my back ever again. I was devastated, as this had put an end to my military career before it had even started. "What's the good news?" I nervously joked. I was later fitted with a full torso cast, and was told to wear it for a minimum of 8 weeks and return to barracks. The medical treatment I received from the army was second to none, with the battalion bringing in a physiotherapist to treat me once daily to begin with, then twice daily as my recovery progressed. Once the cast was removed, I went under intense rehabilitation and was gradually allowed to return to the gym. My aim was to rejoin my company in Northern Ireland, as I still felt an overwhelming sense of abandonment towards them. This would motivate me to prove everyone wrong, get back to full fitness, and finally deploy with my company to South Armagh. It was during the summer of 1997 that I first encountered Soldier G. Soldier G's career would almost mirror my own through operational deployments and postings. Not that it is relevant to you or me, but in the Irish Guards, he was a Southern Irish Roman Catholic, and depending where you were sent, this could be a bad thing in this period. Soldier G came from a family with a rich military background from within the Irish Defence Force, and was motivated to join the British Army under the premise of soldiering on operations. Like myself, he was very much captivated by the romantic relationship between young men and warfare. But in Soldier G's case, this desire for soldiering never left him, and this would always be his priority throughout his distinguished career. Like myself, Soldier G had joined 4 Company straight from training, and after a few weeks would be deployed in South Armagh before me. I was envious, but this motivated me even more. Finally, my determination and hard work had paid off. I had been purposefully and relentlessly running past battalion headquarters twice daily, often in full military equipment, to catch the commanding officers' and adjutant's attention. The order had come through. At last I was deployed for the final 10 weeks of the tour. 4 months prior, in a hospital bed, I had questioned the prospect of alternative careers, as mine as a soldier appeared to be over. I recall being overjoyed with the physical recovery that I had made, and specifically being in the company stores, receiving my operational body armour. Then, we all heard a single pop of nearby gunfire. Another soldier had just committed suicide. This time, a member of the sergeant's mess from the Irish Guards. Sergeant Nash had asked to inspect a loaded rifle from one of the sentries guarding the back gate. Then, without hesitation or warning, shot himself. I never knew this member of the Irish Guards, and as callous as it sounds, in that specific moment, I wasn't really bothered about it. I was exclusively focused on fulfilling the Army's needs of deploying on my first operational tour, which had now become my own needs. I'm shocked with myself for not having had an emotional response to this incident at the time. Perhaps I did, but I was using the tools instilled through my behavioral training to suppress these certain emotions. Soldiers have an unhealthy relationship with death. This is a combination of our training, where we are programmed to deny our basic survival instincts. We are taught to run towards danger, rather than away from it. Then there is both the military mindset to consider, as well as those who ignorantly choose to deny the dangers of soldiering. This would become more relevant on the more attrition tours of Iraq and Afghanistan, when far too many soldiers thought they were impervious to enemy action. It was not uncommon for soldiers to frequently survive dangerous firefights, improvised explosive devices, and mortar fire. These persistent brushes with death every now and then would generate an invincibility mindset within some soldiers. Yet sadly, this was not the case, and often proved to be fatal. Like many soldiers, the first time I was to travel on an aeroplane was not to go on the traditional family holiday, but rather to deploy overseas. In my case, I was doubly excited, as it was my first time on an aeroplane, and I was also deploying on my first operational tour to Northern Ireland. I would then be taken to Palace Barracks for an in-theatre briefing before being flown by helicopter to Bessbrook Mill in South Armagh. I felt overwhelmed with jubilation and was looking forward to linking up with 10 Platoon. Since breaking my back, I had felt guilty for not being able to deploy, and guilt for abandoning my comrades. I had worked hard on my rehabilitation to get here, and I was determined to make up for lost time. I had convinced myself that the lads would be happy to see me, and would appreciate the struggle that I had undergone to get here. Yet again, I would be mistaken. On arrival, I was quickly thrown into guard duty at the helipad at Bessbrook Mill. The more senior guardsmen also made me do their guard duties, and I quickly became the fall guy for every shitty job and task. If someone needed their washing doing, I was tasked. If someone needed something from the NAFI, the shop, I would get it. If extra guard duty was required, I was nominated. If extra security of the helipad was required, you guessed it, it was me. I have no downtime and very little sleep. But Niall had advised me to stop answering back to the more senior guardsman and not to speak up for myself. I concluded to myself that if I tried to fit in, then I would eventually be accepted. I had noticed that Niall was a shell of his former self, quiet and lacking in confidence. But this is what I longed for. So I just knuckled down and hoped for the best. Years later, Niall would turn his back on soldiering and retrain as the military tailor for the battalion. I cannot help but wonder if our early experiences of sectarian bullying motivated him to do so. South Armagh was a notoriously dangerous province to operate in, as it was mainly rural and bordered the Republic. Cross-border shoots were frequent, and road vehicles were banned due to the amount of improvised explosive devices. And then there was the IRA 50 caliber sniper team to contemplate. In short, it was a dangerous place. The terrain is arduous and can be unforgiving. And then there is the high Catholic anti-British population to consider. When on foot patrols, we would be frequently abused verbally, and the kids would often throw rocks at us. I initially found this difficult to comprehend, as this was part of Britain, and yet somehow kept undisclosed from the general public on the mainland, and is why I fundamentally believe that the events of Northern Ireland will always be perceived as a stain on British history. After about a month into my tour, or almost 5 months for everyone else, I recall that we were coming to the end of a 24-hour patrol, and everyone was tired. As usual, I carried all of the electronic countermeasures, ECM, including spare batteries, and even my patrol commander's flask. We were operating in a 4-man team, but part of a multiple of 2 other such teams. I recall that we had gone firm and were waiting to be collected by our helicopter. And naturally, I was on guard, whilst the others rested. It was a hot summer's afternoon, and the patrol had been uneventful when it began to rain. This was odd, I thought to myself, as there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. Then it dawned on me. 2 of the guardsmen from another team were pissing on me, to the rest of the multiple's amusement. I would have the last laugh, though, as these guardsmen would have to sit next to me on the chopper ride back to Bestbrook Mill whilst I was stinking of piss. What is disappointing to this day is that none of the junior commanders intervened, or even disciplined the culprits. A week later, I recall that we'd been on a night patrol and my team commander, who was notoriously bad at map reading, had taken us to the wrong pickup point for the helicopter. He would often ask the locals for directions, or let one of the other guardsmen map read for him. Due to his navigational error, he decided that we would patrol on the roads through a small town called Silverbridge to make up for lost time. At the time, this didn't trigger any red flags, because I was inexperienced. But Silverbridge was an out-of-bounds town area and was even marked with red on our maps. Silverbridge was a small border town with a strong IRA presence, and as such, for our own safety, under no circumstances were we allowed to patrol through it. My team leader, however, decided that he knew better. Despite it being in the early hours of the morning, he had gambled with our lives that this route was safe. I was the 4th man on the patrol, the rear man, the most inexperienced, and was carrying all the heavy kit and equipment. I vividly remember that the town was dead. The sun was coming up from our front, which was blinding our vision, and by the time that I had entered the town, the metal dustbins were already beating like jungle drums. Not long afterwards, a crowd started to gather, and rocks were being thrown at us. I started to panic at the prospect of being snatched, as I was the last man. We were all aware of the infamous death of Captain Robert Nyrak, and I decided that this was not going to be my fate, and started to run towards the rest of my team. As the hostilities increased, they too had begun to increase the pace. By now, I was the second man out of the team, and before long, I was the front man, leading our extraction, despite the fact that I alone was carrying all the heavy equipment. Even to this day, I sincerely believe that if I had not initiated the hard extraction from this patrol, one of us would have been snatched, or at the very least, seriously hurt. Once out of the town and at a safe distance, we looked back to see the large, angry mob of Republicans that had gathered. We were lucky and laughed about our potentially dangerous encounter, and my patrol commander asked us to keep it a team secret. So I did just that, hoping that on return to Bestbrook Mill, I would be treated slightly better. I continued to be quiet and just accept all of the crap that continued to come my way from the rest of the tour in an attempt to fit in. However, I finally snapped one evening towards the end of the tour, when we were granted a night's rest and recuperation. We had all been drinking, and I may or may not have started a small scuffle which ended up with 2 NCOs beating me with an unplugged iron. Once the fighting had finally finished, my multiple commander gave the order for me to stand to attention, and like the obedient drone I was, I did as I was ordered, and didn't move. Then my team commander repeatedly hit me in the face with the iron. The following year, this same team commander would later be thrown out of the British Army for bullying. He was a dinosaur of the previous generation, where physical bullying was rife and institutionally accepted. These particular NCOs were not fit to lead. They believed that respect was best earned through fear and violence, which had a harmful knock-on effect on the Guardsman. I have taken many managerial and leadership lessons from this experience, and would use these horrendous examples to mould my own leadership style later on in my career. I had always believed that no matter how bad a life experience was, that I must take something positive away from this. In this case, it was how not to lead and manage soldiers. I firmly believe that it was the NCO's lack of ability to cope with the demands of operational pressures that created a toxic atmosphere within my multiple. These few bad eggs were by no means a reflection of the Irish Guards as a whole, and they were just that, a bad batch. As I progressed through the ranks as a commander, I would use humour as a positive tool to ease the operational stresses on the Guardsmen, and be as informal as possible when appropriate. I would make mistakes along the way, but tried to be the polar opposite of the bully boys of that early period of my career. I do not feel that my early experiences within the Irish Guards had an impact on my mental health, as, by now, I was institutionalised, and this treatment was just accepted at the time. My childhood had made me tough, and my experience of bullying was probably not too dissimilar to many other soldiers of that period. What is relevant, though, is how the majority of the non-commissioned officers, or commissioned officers for that matter, didn't give a crap about the welfare of the Guardsmen. Don't get me wrong, there were some who were brilliant, such as Swifty. But sadly, in my early experiences, only a few. Mental health awareness was not a popular topic for discussion. After all, poor mental health was rammed into us as a weakness, and we were not weak. Therefore, it is important to understand the mentality of the British Army in the late 90s, as some of these poor junior commanders would eventually become the senior commanders of the future. More pertinently, throughout the prolonged War on Terror in Iraq and Afghanistan that would leave its hidden mark on so many of my brethren.